Good evening. Welcome to the Woodchuck Report on this fine day of June 8th, 2018. I'm your host, Varpilah Chase, and got several things in stores for you tonight. So, first thing first, I'd like to talk about a thing that a friend of mine happened to send my way. Maybe some of you have noticed or heard about it. Is the headline that was told to me was $10,000 for remote workers, and that's $10,000. So Vermont was giving out $10,000 to people to bring people here to live in Vermont. So of course that piqued my interest, and I had to check out some more. So the gist of it really is it's $10,000 for someone who commits to living in Vermont, who is working remotely from home for any out-of-state business. So, and one of the things is, where's this money coming from? The money would be coming from the general fund appropriation, which is going to be used across the 3 years that the bill is being crafted by the legislature. So essentially, if you're working remotely from home, they will give you up to $10,000 to come live in Vermont and work for some out-of-state business. And this money coming from the general fund's appropriation. Now, it's right now is a 3-year bill, and there are caps to the bill, so not just everyone who signs up gets it. And as I said, it's up to $10,000, but they're going to be going on a case-by-case basis, so you may not get the actual full $10,000 depending on who you are and what you're working for. So some of the caps is the first year is $125,000, second year $250,000, then $125,000 for the third year. And as I said, this is all coming from the General Fund Appropriations Bill, which is going to be used across all 3 years. Now, it is, I say current tense, because the exact details of this still has not been fully ironed out. It seems they kind of just made the bill, threw it out there, and they're still ironing out all the actual details. It's not supposed to go into effect till this upcoming January, so they still have approximately 6 months and counting to figure out the details without screwing it up. Don't hold your breath. So, next topic I'm going to go on is the Vermont State Board of Education. They have now released their regional meeting schedule, and the design of the schedule is to collect the local testimony for Act 46. Act 46 is the Vermont State School Consolidation Bill that was passed in 2015. So the 3 dates they have are July 18th, which will be in the Newark School at Caledonia County, August 15th, which is at the State House in Montpelier, and September 19th, the Green Mountain High School in Chester, Vermont. Now, as I was saying, Act 46 is the School District Consolidation Bill, which was passed in 2015, and some of the things that they've seen, this is all coming from the Secretary of Education, is in the past few years, 146 towns have approved school district consolidation plan according to the Agency of Education, which right now those 146 towns account for about 68% of the Vermont students. Now there are still 44 districts who have voted no against it, and so this is really what they're planning on having these meetings for, is to try to get those 44 districts on board with the whole act. Now, the Secretary of Education, she has released a plan which would force 18 of those 44 districts to merge. And so, as I was saying, all these upcoming meetings are there to give these school boards a chance to, well, meetings will allow the school boards to be given a chance to convince the education not to force the merger, but also to give the school boards themselves more room to, well, time to get along with it. Because, long story short, the state could more or less force them to consolidate against their will. So now the final statewide plan has to be met by November 30th of this year for a bunch of other reasons, including budgetary reasons. So hence why it has these 3 meetings in both July, August, and September. Next thing on my list to go on in terms of education spending is an article. This is make sure I get his name right, Rob Roper of the Ethan Allen Institute. I ran across this article and was reading it. I agree with it in a lot of respects, but it was more of a proposal that he put out there that at least had me interested. Decided to let you guys know about it. Hopefully call your state legislature, whoever your rep is, and start talking about how to better fund education, since the crux of all town spending bills is education. So the article that he wrote on was called "The Diner's Dilemma in Vermont Education Spending." It was published in June 4th, 2018 of this year by Rob Roper of the Ethan Allen Institute. Now he goes on to talk about a phenomenon in behavior economics called the diner's dilemma. Now I'm going to try to read this verbatim so you can get the actual thing without me trying to mumble things. So, the diner's dilemma, which tracks how people act when evenly splitting a dinner check versus paying individually. The conclusion of these experiments show that when people pay for their own consumption, they spend less than when sharing the cost with others. As several studies have shown, roughly 30%. Now, what does this have to do with the education? Well, he goes on to say, Vermont's education financing system is built on a dynamic very similar to splitting the check. Local districts order what they want for their meal. The state collects the money in one large pool and redistributes it to cover the total bill. Now, the psychological incentive is for districts to spend more so that other districts will end up subsidizing their portion of the bill and not the other way around. The result being that the total bill is bigger, and much to the NEA's delight, which is as he's saying, why the system is designed in the first place. Now, he goes to say, according to the problem, which it is by design, under our current system, there is no real accountability. The legislators who set the tax rate blame local voters for passing high school budgets. Local officials blame the legislators for the funding of systems that leads to high property tax bills. And so you get a vicious circular logic going on. So for you residents, the question is, if you wanted to change things, who do you vote out of office, since that's how our most powerful tool we have is voting. So if you don't like who's controlling the system, who do you vote out for? Who's really accountable? And he goes and says it's very hard to say. So he's saying this: the dynamic has to be broken, and Act 60, which guarantees students have equal access to education funding, makes for separate checks illegal. So no one back to the analogy, each person cannot pay for their individual bill. It all comes from the total bill. So Governor Scott's proposal was to increase mandates from Montpelier for specifically things like the staff-student ratios. If you remember, he's cutting down the ratio from 6:1 to approximately 5:1. Now, the legislature is implementing mandated mergers under Act 46, which I just covered. And so all these solutions, which are in serious infringements to the local control, as he goes on to say, is a concept that Act 60 may become a myth. So Governor Scott's proposal is to rein in cost, reinstate some measure of local control, and inject accountability into the process, which is to have the legislature set a uniform per pupil spending level with some allowances for the special needs students, but also allow local school boards to control how much they spend, which would be free from the overall state level interference. Now, under the system, school budgets would be determined by the total number of students times set tuition rate. So there would be some loss of local control, as he went and acknowledged, as to how much it would be to spend, but there'd be far more local control of how to spend it. And the analogy he goes on to use, would you prefer a $13 meal that I choose for you, or $10 for you to spend on whatever you like? So there's a tit for tat, quid pro quo, if you will. So under this system, if you don't like your tax bill, under this system, you can fire your state rep or senators, vote them out, because they are the one who will be responsible for how much or how little you are spending. And if you don't like how the school is being run, you can fire the local school board, since they're the one who are calling the shots, which is the accountability portion that is brought back into this. So he goes on to say it's pretty much the model which Vermont's independent schools that accept tuition students operate. And so for the most part, they get tremendous results for fewer taxpayer dollars. We know that this model works, It has had about a century and a half long track record in Vermont, and he says moreover it will be a much fairer system which would comply with and even exceed the equal access of Act 60. As opposed to where now students only have equal access to funds, but extremely unequal per pupil funding from school to school across the state under the new proposed system, they will have equal funding. So that was just the article that I read by Rob Roper of the Ethan Allen Institute. I suggest you read them, go to their website and read it more, but this is just a proposal of how to better fund education and to still comply with Act 46 and Act 60 as well. Now, speaking of both budgets, there's been a big fight amongst the on a state budget. Since the Senate has barely passed a state budget bill, but Governor Scott has already vowed to veto it. So I'll read some of the arguments and things that I've come across in my research. So both the governor and the legislature are refusing to capitulate. The legislature is refusing to capitulate on demands from the governor and to eliminate the possibility of a non-residential property tax hike next year. So as you may remember, Governor Scott has promised that there will be no new taxes. So he's promised not to raise taxes. So the Senate passed a bill last Thursday that will prevent a government shutdown, but as Governor Scott has said, he's going to veto it. So lawmakers are right now currently gridlocked for the spending package, and so the House introduced a new budget bill, H13, which in an effort to ensure that the government stays open, even though all the parties aren't exactly having resolved all the impasse by the end of this month. So if the governor kills the bill, which he has promised to do already, because it leaves in a default tax, as I was saying, it's the automatic tax that's going to kick in. Both the lawmakers and administration will have less than 3 weeks to come up to the table and hammer a new deal to avert a government shutdown. So without an appropriation from the legislature by June 30th, the state will have extremely limited latitude in providing funds for state agencies, public services, and schools, i.e. government shutdown. So some Democrats are hopeful that Scott will not veto it, but he's already promised, he's almost vowed to say he will because of the default tax increase, which goes against his campaign promises. So some people say that President Pro Tem Tim Ashe, which Democrat progressive Chitin, said he's hopeful the governor will not vote against it, but as I've said repeatedly now, he's going to vote for it, which is going to bring them back to give them the 3 weeks in turn to provide a new budget. So even with the possible shutdown, so both sides have really have little progress in reaching a deal since they were called back to, since they were called back to legislature this past month. So the new budget bill, H13, which is put on the table, is the hope that legislatures which will fix the bulk of the budget in place for the next fiscal year, but it's also leaving the contentious tax and education finance provisions, which is the main reason of the vow to veto. So they have promised to seek agreements on some of these outstanding issues, but in the second piece of legislation, but without actually addressing the shutdown threat. Let's see. Let me go. So one of the things they're talking about is setting the default non-residential property tax rate, which right now is set to $1.50 per, I believe, 100 square. I actually do not have $1.59, which would be a 5.5% property tax rate. So Senator Randy Brock, Republican Franklin, has been saying that failing to set a lower rate in the bill would essentially allow a backdoor tax. So he has proposed an amendment that would set the default rate to $1.53 as opposed to $1.59. But the Democrats shot that down. Many of the arguments from the Democrats saying it would be yielding to the governor's position, which is to no new taxes. So, and then fellow Democrats are saying it would be the amendment would be the end of negotiations with Scott, and Democrats really don't want to give any favors to Governor Scott currently. So there's a lot more to that. For example, Governor Scott is hoping to use $34.5 million surplus money, to buy down the education property tax rates for next year, which are part of the problem of going so. And he says he's going to put in place a slew of education finance policy changes, which he could generate $300 million in savings. Democrats are saying there's one-time money to buy down the taxes. It's bad fiscal policy and only creates a bigger tax gap in the next year when the apparent tax increase will be even greater after another year of artificially low rates. So they are arguing that the budget bill is already built on compromise with the administration, and they have no desire to compromise anymore with Governor Scott's administration. So they're proposing that $10 million of one-time money in the education fund to fill reserve and sets the default property tax to next year's level. So Senator Dick Sears, no Democrat Bennington, is saying the only way he could see this new bill, H13, which will allow skirting of vetoes, is if the lawmakers can make progress on a second bill, which will include the tax rates in the time between both Governor Scott receives the legislatures and when he decides to veto it. But as he's been pretty clear, he's not game for this. There's a little more, and I'll keep you up to date for next month, the final answer. But I've been giving my time warning, so I'll go on to my next big thing, which is back to tariffs. So let me pull up additional information here. As I've said, as in the previous reports, I've said President Trump has put in tariffs on both steel and aluminum. Sorry. So those tariffs were aimed at China because, as he's proposed, he's been saying China has been dumping low-priced steel into the world market and therefore the U.S. market, and so tariffs are needed in terms of he's using the national defense argument in controlling tariffs. The U.S. being part of the World Trade Organization, we're not allowed to do things such as this unless we cite national defense and national security, which is exactly the way he went about it. So quick recap, he put 25% tariffs on steel and 10% on aluminum. And so the problem that this is becoming now is the fact that it's designed to hit China and to make theirs more expensive and to help save our steel industry and to hit China back on the dumping of their low-priced steel and aluminum. Now, the big problem that it's going to hit us is the fact that we don't actually buy a lot of steel and aluminum from China. The majority of our steel and aluminum comes from our allies, Canada and Mexico. So the fact that he's put tariffs on steel and aluminum to stop China actually hurts our allies more. For example, last year we bought $12.4 billion worth of steel and aluminum from Canada, $7.7 billion from the EU, $2.9 billion from Mexico, but only $2.9 billion from China, and $2 billion for Japan. So, as you can see just from those numbers, the hardest hit for these tariffs are going to be Canada, EU, Mexico, and obviously Japan far less than China. And of course, the new tariffs have gone into effect, and both the EU has already started hitting back with their own tariffs, which we've already started a trade war, which, as I've said, trade wars help nobody. No one wins from a trade war. So our allies have been complaining about it because obviously they're hit the hardest the most. And some of the consequences of these tariffs, besides being the tariff war, which no one wins a tariff war, is that we, the consumers, are actually going to get hit with higher prices for a lot of things. because both aluminum and steel are used in a lot of everyday products. You know, whether your cat food, aluminum cans, obviously your canned perishable goods uses aluminum, and some of the big things that President Trump is not saying he's going to hit with tariffs is autos. There's going to be tariffs on any automobiles coming into America, which, unless you've never driven a car, know nothing about cars, the majority of our cars, for at least the domestic market, is built not only in the US, but Canada and Mexico. If you're a fan of GM or Ford, you know they have factories in both Canada and Mexico. So a tariff on cars is going to be a tariff on our allies again. So as I said, the reasons is to save the steel aluminum industry. Sorry, I keep saying. Because China's been dumping steel in the global market, and obviously China, damn it. And we buy very little from China in the first place. So I have more examples. These are, economic reasons. Economists who are saying some of the side effects and some of the arguments against these tariffs. So rather than write them all down, I'm going to read it off for you. So, most of our allies, including us, everyone agrees that China is the major cause of the problem. But as I said earlier, we buy very little steel and aluminum from China. So these tariffs aren't actually hitting China so much as hitting our allies. So Trump's advisor, Peter Navarro, he's been arguing that our allies aren't all different from China and deserve the tariffs if they don't agree to limit how much steel they send to the U.S., which kind of goes against the whole free market trade. Is you supply and demand. If demand is higher, you keep supplying, and so on until you get to a price equilibrium. So one of the big problems globally is that the fact that not only China, but a lot of countries who produce aluminum and steel have a lot of overcapacity. If supply is too high and demand doesn't reach that, prices drop. Economy 101. So that they're arguing that a lot of the countries should be acknowledging this and doing more to lower their trade surplus. So opponents of the tariffs, including myself, are saying that the national security claim is extremely bogus because we don't have a national security problem with steel and aluminum. Why? Because the people who buy our steel and aluminum from are our allies. For example, Canada and Mexico. So unless we somehow are going to war with them tomorrow, our steel aluminum reserves we're fine. We're pretty good. And so, many of the arguments are that the tariffs in the name of national defense is really an absurd and amazing, in my own words, amazing stupid reason to use it, but he had to find a way anyways. If there's a will, there's a way. So some of the impacts that we're going to have, overall the impact is going to be little to moderate, only because we have such a large economy, and aluminum and steel is a relatively small amount of our actual dollars of our economy. We have a $19 trillion economy, so these tariffs are only going to be affecting billions of dollars of steel and aluminum, which in context is going to be relatively small. Now, what the tariffs do is increase the chance of a full-blown trade war, which has already started. The EU has already started to enact some of their tariffs against us. China enacted some of their tariffs against us as well. And Mexico and Canada are now getting ready to do the same. So we're getting ready to get into a very nasty trade war. And us having such a strong economy, we're huge importers of a lot of things. And we tend to export usually high price and higher quality items, which is gonna hurt. So, well, there's a lot more, but I'll actually wrap that up just because it's gonna be a long drizzle. So I'd like to thank you for watching the Woodchuck Report on today, and I will have more for you. But as I was saying, it's more on tariffs and trade, and a lot of more numbers and details that, to be frank, you don't need to be bored with nor bothered with. So with that, I'll give you good night. Have fun, stay safe, and don't do anything I wouldn't do. All right, thanks for watching.